Well, everyone, it's time for us to go and take a look at the Samsung Galaxy A20 and see how this specific phone holds up in 2023. Now, I will probably tell you this phone is probably not worth buying anymore, but I still look at a phone like the Galaxy A20 and I'm still kind of surprised how decent of a job Samsung did back in 2019 with somewhat of a budget phone. Like, this was not supposed to be a expensive Galaxy S20 at the time replacement. This was not competing with any crazy phones. This was supposed to be kind of a cheap alternative to a lot of other phones in the market, and I kind of do think that Samsung did a great job with it. Now, if you want to buy some phones that I'd probably recommend more to buy than this thing, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside of the Samsung Galaxy A20, on the front of this phone, we actually had a pretty ginormous 6.4-inch Super AMOLED display. Now, this was a fairly large panel at that time, and it's still a massive panel. And this is the thing that I think Samsung does really well, is that they just make some of the best panels really ever. Their TVs look great, their monitors look great, and their phone panels are some of the best panels out there. And that is something that whenever Samsung makes a new phone, I'm always looking forward to basically the newer panels that they can make, and this is no exception. Now, with something like the Galaxy A20, the resolution of this display really wasn't like the highest resolution of all time. I think we all kind of know that. But the thing with the Galaxy A20 is that this is, not a super expensive phone. Although it was a 720p display, the display itself was an AMOLED display, a tiny bit of bezel at the bottom, and it had that like Infinity V display up top. But I think it looked pretty good, and I was kind of a fan of how this phone kind of looked like at that time. Now, some I/O, we had a charging port at the bottom, we had a headphone jack on this phone, but we also had that microSD card slot on this phone as well. Now, with this type of device, this was kind of like one of the last phones to have, a microSD card slot from Samsung. Samsung still kind of puts it, I think, on some of their phones, but for the most part, a majority of their devices do not have microSD card slots anymore. But the Galaxy A20 from 2019 still has that type of capability, which is honestly kind of funny. So from that perspective, that's kind of crazy right there as well. Now, on the back, we do have a plastic back. So this is expected from a phone at this price range. So, I don't think anybody would expect like the most expensive premium feeling stuff on this phone. It's pretty much what you'd expect at the end of the day, in my opinion. But with something like the Galaxy A20, you were getting a kind of like a dual camera setup on the back, which we'll kind of talk about in a second. It also had a fingerprint sensor on the back of this phone, which for better or for worse, it was a fingerprint sensor, it kind of worked, which, is still kind of nice. The plastic back, and that's pretty much all you were getting. So with this type of phone, you weren't getting any crazy bells and whistles. It was a very, very average performing phone on pretty much every level, but that's exactly what this phone was going for. It wasn't going for a super expensive phone at the time. It's going for a cheap phone that you can buy at like, Walmart or somewhere that, a lot of people can pick up. They were trying to sell quantity of these numbers, not necessarily quality. So from that perspective, that kind of covers it up there. Now, in that camera department, like I mentioned before, this specific phone did actually have that dual camera setup. Now, it's quite fascinating because the camera itself, although it wasn't that good at all, it still had some interesting hardware. So you had that dual camera setup on the back. I kind of said that 30 times. It was a 13 megapixel wide angle camera, then it was a 5 megapixel ultra wide camera. So what shocks me the most about this phone is that it actually did have an ultra wide camera over something like a macro or depth lens. A lot of manufacturers end up using something like that to give the illusion that it's like a dual camera setup, when in reality it pretty much isn't, not really in the way you would think. So you could do 1080p video on the back of the specific phone. On the front, it had an 8 megapixel camera, and it had 1080p on the front of that phone. So I think that in and of itself is very interesting. It's not really the first phone I would think of as like a good budget tier phone, but with something like the Samsung Galaxy A20, for it having that type of capability right there, I think is already pretty decent. And for how old this phone is and for what this phone cost at the time, I think it's kind of cool, to be honest. So not a good camera phone anymore, but I think at that time for the price tag, it was kind of impressive for what they were able to do. So that kind of covers it up there as well. Now, moving on to the software and pretty much the longevity of this phone, this is kind of the bigger issue with this phone. It's not really supported with software anymore. It's been unsupported for many years now, and that's kind of what's going on. When you get a phone like the Samsung Galaxy, A20, you are getting a phone that has been unsupported with software for many years. And when that happens, it makes buying this phone so much less appealing. It makes pretty much no sense at all of buying a phone like this anymore, since it's been unsupported. You're not getting any more features. and when I say unsupported, I mean it's been unsupported for a few years now. So because of that, this phone at that time, it was cool. Apparently it got Android 11, which is kind of impressive. But all in all, it's not really a phone I would recommend anybody to buy anymore. You're much better off buying a phone like a Samsung Galaxy S21 that's still kind of supported, the S22. If you want to go the cheaper route, I would recommend even buying a Galaxy S10 over this phone, to be honest, as well. So with that kind of being said, I do kind of want to say one other thing. With a phone like the Galaxy A20, it is kind of impressive that when you're getting a phone like this, it still got these software updates that were kind of there, like it's still kind of supported with software, which is kind of cool in terms of maybe a security update here and there like a year or two ago. But beyond that, it's not really worth buying, to be honest. Now, from the performance side, this phone had that Exynos 7884 chipset inside with 3 gigabytes of RAM. So this phone pretty much only had one model, and it was that 3 gigabyte of RAM model. As you can tell by my voice, definitely not that good of a performing phone. By this point, at that moment, I think we already had phones that had, probably even like 6 or 8 gigabytes of RAM. So for this thing having 3 gigabytes of RAM, even in 2019, is pretty wild. Even the iPhones of that time, I think, already had like 4 gigabytes of RAM with the iPhone 11. So it's kind of crazy. But with that being said, it's still kind of impressive what, Samsung was able to do here. So this phone is not fast. It is not a good performing phone by any means. But I do think for that moment, it is kind of impressive, for this phone being as cheap as it was, for being able to handle what you threw at it. So this phone, I would, not give it a, good score at all in terms of the performance side. But you have to keep in mind that this phone wasn't really going for the most expensive phone at the time. It was supposed to be a good, cheap, quality budget phone. And I think from that perspective, I think Samsung did okay. I feel like maybe they could have done a better job, but, for the quality and everything that you were getting there, I think it's quite impressive. So from the performance side, it's not really going to be able to handle basically anything you throw at it anymore. It's going to be very much basically like a cheap phone, if you can kind of, put it in that perspective. But I think that's understandable. And when you're getting a phone like this, I think that in and of itself kind of makes a little bit of sense in my opinion. So from the performance side, that kind of covers it up there as well. Now from the battery life side, this phone actually ended up having a 4000 mAh battery inside of it, which is honestly a pretty good size battery to have on a phone like this. So that in and of itself is kind of impressive. And when you mix that in the fact that this phone wasn't even that heavy performing of a phone, that just kind of makes things even more complicated because this phone, big size battery at that time, not that powerful. This battery life could theoretically last you a long period of time. So that in and of itself is kind of impressive as well. And to kind of sum up this whole entire video, what I'll tell you is the Samsung Galaxy A20 pretty much is not worth buying. As I've kind of mentioned, it's not really a secret. This phone has been outdated for quite a bit of time. It's quite old as well. So it just makes a less and less sense of buying a phone like this at all. But I will tell you, it is still impressive what Samsung was able to do here at that moment. They were able to make a pretty good, decent quality phone at a fairly cheap, reliable price tag. And I think that in and of itself deserves some credit. So although this wouldn't be a phone I would recommend anybody to buy anymore, I still like this phone a lot. And I think, I wouldn't recommend buying it, but it still brought some stuff to the table, which is kind of impressive. So from that perspective, that kind of covers it up there. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.